Welcome back to Life After Prison. Normally on the podcast, we have guests who share their lived experience of prison and what life is like after release.
Yes, but there are some big questions that kept coming up for us, like, does prison actually rehabilitate? And how do different parts of the system make that easier or harder?
Yeah, so in this 4-part mini-series, we wanted to delve into these questions a little bit more. And to do that, Jules, you had to go and speak to some professionals, didn't you?
I did. These are people who work in and around prisons, and I wanted to hear their perspective on rehabilitation and what could be done better. We are always wanting to know and wanting to understand what prison is really there for and what it's designed for. We've spoken to MPs before, and they agree that it should be there for both rehabilitation and for protection of the public.
Yep.
But it's always seemed like a little bit of a grey area for us. And
Seems a bit slanted towards one side more. However, I think these questions are relevant, especially if you've been behind the door or worked in the prison environment and seen what it's like. So
yeah, I feel like when you're actually inside, for example, for us, it's always been a little bit confusing, and it doesn't feel like it's really set up for rehabilitation. I guess that's why we keep coming back to the same question. So we wanted to dive a little deeper and get some expert opinions. And after speaking to who I spoke to, things make a little bit more sense.
Okay, so then tell me about the first episode then.
All right, so in this first episode, I speak to Roland Karthaus. He's an architect. He's looked a lot at prison and prison design. He's really interested in how the way prisons are built and how it can either support people in their rehabilitation or how it can get in the way.
Okay.
So I asked him about the role of rehabilitation itself in the prison design, the cost of building new prisons versus investing in people, and what would need to change if rehabilitation really was priority.
Okay, cool.
Super interesting.
Yeah, and I've been listening to that conversation, and it's not something you normally think about, like the design of a prison, how that can affect someone and like affect their sentence, but not just their sentence, like affect how they come out and life after prison. You know what I mean?
So in the episode, we're also going to hear voices that you guys listening or watching may recognize. People from previous Life After Prison guests, they shared their own experiences of being inside. In this first episode, you'll be hearing from Tony Supreme talking about getting out the city, Frankie on visits and what they meant to him, Sobanan talking about the role of prisons in society, and Joelle on the importance of prevention. And we'll put links to their full episodes in the description if you want to hear more.
Yeah, if you want to hear more, definitely. So let's get into it.
Well, Roland, thank you so much for doing this today and joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
Oh, I love that. So first of all, for everybody listening, can you just say who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course. My name's Roland Karthaus. I'm an architect. I've been practicing as an architect for 25 years. I now work in consultancy, working with the public sector, looking at how buildings and places are commissioned. The work that I've been doing in prisons has been working with other professionals to understand how the design of prisons affects people's health and well-being. And yeah, that's where my interests are.
Well, that is the exact reason why we wanted you on the podcast today. So thank you. Can we start with exploring what actually brought you into this field and what is it about prison design that caught your attention?
Yeah, of course. So I did a project which was more than 10 years ago with an organisation called the RSA. It's a very old organisation that's like a think tank. So they research and make policy. And they were interested in how the land that surrounds prisons could be put to better use. We worked with HMP Humber and we looked at HMP Humber has a lot of land around it. And we did a big project with that prison, thinking about how that land could be repurposed for activities that people in the prison could take part in as part of employment and skills training and working with local organisations. And the idea was that it was a model for how all prisons that have land around them that's controlled by the Ministry of Justice could start to think about that land for rehabilitation, not just the prison itself. That really got me interested because when we were working with that prison, we spent a lot of time in the prison talking to people inside and prison officers. And I remember one conversation we had with a group of people in prison and we asked who was here for the first time, and only one person put their hand up. And it just made me realise that if prisons are supposed to be about rehabilitation, then something clearly isn't working. And I'm always very driven by situations where I can see the built environment could do a lot more to make things better. So I was interested in how the design of prisons could support rehabilitation more, how it could be designed better. But I wasn't actually interested in designing prisons. I was just interested in understanding the problem better.
Well, you touched on quite a few different points there and some really interesting points about rehabilitation, which we're definitely going to come on to. But also, the space around prison. I'm guessing that there's quite a lot of space around most prisons. I mean, especially knowing how little I know about the surrounding of prisons, we just kind of know what's inside. But they tend to be kind of, in the middle of nowhere sometimes, and possibly quite a lot of land around it that isn't being used. Is that with most prisons?
Yeah, that's definitely, I don't know if it's with most prisons, but it's definitely true with a lot of prisons. What was interesting about HMP Humber was it was originally built as a borstal, so a prison for young offenders, and the land was deliberately developed as a farm so that boys in the prison could take part in agricultural activities on the farm. And over time, as the prison was re-rolled and then security became more of a priority, the farm fell into disrepair. So there's all this farmland around this prison with nothing happening on it. I mean, it's good for wildlife, but not much else. And then you've got this prison where people are brought into the prison, usually in a van with blacked out windows. So they don't even know that they never see outside of the walls. When we worked with people in the prison and we showed them a plan of the site, they were all amazed that there was this land outside the walls that they just weren't aware of. So it's this amazing asset that's there that you could make use of. A lot of modern prisons, quite often the Ministry of Justice buys a bigger site than the prison needs because they may want to expand it in future. So yes, lots of modern prisons also have essentially empty land that's sort of safeguarded for future use, which could be put to other purposes.
I was talking to someone and they were asking me like, yeah, so what's the work about that you're trying to do? And I mentioned the retreats. And he's like, oh, that's sick. Like, for a lot of us in prison, the only time we've been out of our city is, prison or for activities that get us into prison, but not to actually rest and recover.
Well,
and
even
You
if
framed
you're
that
in
really nicely.
even if you're in prison in these areas, you don't see it.
yeah, you don't see it. Do
You
know
just
what I
see
mean?
the walls of your prison cell, you know?
No, you see it in the sweatbox.
You go on the drive.
You see it in the sweatbox.
Yeah, for what? One ride.
Loads of sheep and fields.
What is it that you've learned about prison design from the work that you've done?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things. So the work that we did was to try and understand how the design of prison buildings affects people that are living and working in them, and how that in turn might improve or make rehabilitation harder or more difficult. I think there's some bigger things to say about like the location of prisons. So there's a lot of evidence that if you have smaller prisons that are close to communities, that makes family visits easier and so on. And that's really important for rehabilitation. A lot of new prisons are very large and they're quite often built away from urban centres. And that means that families would have to travel long distances. So that decision about where you put a prison is probably the biggest decision affecting rehabilitation.
And sorry, when they're considering the location, are they considering rehabilitation in that aspect of people coming to visit, or are they not?
So I think there's lots of factors that go into considering where to locate a prison. There was a policy shift about 10 years ago, which was to create fewer, bigger prisons. And the only sites that you can find to put bigger prisons in are likely to be further away from urban centres. So, for instance, HMP Berwyn is on an industrial estate, on the outskirts of the city. So those are just like practical decisions. I think it's not that rehabilitation isn't considered. It's just that it's one of the many factors. And then obviously cost becomes a factor. And so I guess in that decision making, which is more important, size, scale, cost, rehabilitation, I guess rehabilitation doesn't win in that equation.
Okay.
So I think the really difficult challenge with a prison is that it has to be safe and secure and also support rehabilitation. And sometimes that, like, safety is very important, and you can't have good rehabilitation if you're in an unsafe environment. But at the same time, if security is too much, then that can get in the way of rehabilitation. So there's a balance that you have to try and strike there, and it's an extremely difficult balance. I think part of the reason why that balance is sometimes wrong is that the legal duty on prisons is to be safe and secure, whereas their role in rehabilitation is more like a policy. So when you have to make a decision between these things, you tend to take the view that the law is the more important than the policy. And so quite often it feels like the balance is in the wrong direction. But I suppose the other thing is we spend quite a lot of money on prisons, but the cost of reoffending is many, many times more than that. So the cost of reoffending last year that was estimated by the National Audit Office is almost £20 billion, I think. And the cost of a new prison is somewhere around typically about 250, 300 million pounds. So small savings on the building of a prison are completely outweighed by the cost of reoffending if they don't support rehabilitation. So it feels like the importance of it hasn't been really understood or grasped, and that there is a really big cost to getting it wrong, and we need to rethink that balance, I think.
For my family's sake, I can't turn up on visits like crying and seeing myself dishevelled. So I was telling jokes on visits, telling people, oh, how funny they done this, that. And I just turned into a bit like Ara survived at school, like just turned into a bit of a prankster and just...
Did they come up and see you regularly then?
So, yeah. So my sister brought them up all over the country, really. And they brought them up probably once, twice a month.
So you said at the start your son was 5 and your daughter was 2?
Like 1.
1. So you kind of saw them growing up
in prison,
in prison a little bit.
Was
what was that like?
Like I've said, with first time I see my daughter walk and talk was in Belmarsh, and I don't care what anybody says. That's a bit, I've seen on Instagram people on the beach walking and talking. Look at my kid walking, and mine was as she walked in a visit in Belmarsh. And there are moments you got to, like you say, to stop doing crime. You got to hold their moments, and like got hands stuck on a cooker, just like accidents, kids happen. She come in with a hand. I'm like, I wasn't there. And my son learnt to read, and then I was in a visit, and he read a thing that having photographs taken in Loudon Grange, and he said about, I said, oh, look, the camera's broke. He said, no, it says insufficient funds. I was like, oh no. But yeah, my son hated, he loved visits. My daughter used to come in, hi daddy, and then run in the plaything.
Okay.
But
my son used to start arguments at the end of every visit. And I think it's because he didn't want to say goodbye.
Yeah.
Oh, thinking back now, and you start arguments. I hate you, and things like I'm going to come on a visit, not talk to you. Actually, I'm going to come on a visit and go and talk to your mates. But yeah. So little, I just tried to save the things in prison to sort of like keep you on a straight and narrow.
What kind of things did you learn about the impact of prison on people's mental health?
So what we did was we had an environmental psychologist as part of our team. And there's a lot of evidence about the kinds of things that affect people more generally. So access to sunlight, access to daylight, access to being able to look out of a window. These are things that there's a lot of evidence from environmental psychology more generally out in the world that they have a big impact on your health and well-being. In a typical prison, people coming into prison have more significant health and well-being issues than people in the general population. They're more likely to have substance abuse issues. They're more likely to have physical ill health. And so if you put people who are already more likely to be unwell into an environment that makes them even more unwell, then their chances of being rehabilitated are really poor. So what we wanted to know is, what are the things that really matter out of all that evidence? What really matters in a prison? And the survey that we did really gave us some good evidence about that particular prison in Berwyn, but a lot of the factors are very similar in other prisons. So the things that were really important to people were the ability to have some privacy, to be able to get away from the intensity that is in a prison. And that's really, really important because it's your whole life. Like, you can't just walk out of the prison ever. So being able to have privacy within the prison was really important. But at the same time, being able to have some degree of independence, some choice about where you go in the prison. And this is a Category C prison, so that should be allowed in a Category C prison. It's not a high security prison. So being able to choose where you go should be possible. And that was considered to be really important. Other things, like already mentioned, sunlight and daylight and views were really important, but also noise. HMP Berwyn is almost all entirely hard surfaces on the inside of certainly of the house blocks. And so what happens when you've got a building that's only got hard surfaces is that noise reverberates, it echoes around, and that makes it more noisy, which makes it hard to hear. So then people shout more. And then because people are shouting, you have to shout more. And so very quickly you get this environment where everyone's shouting and nobody can hear anything. And because you can't escape from that environment, you're stuck in an environment that's continuously noisy. And there's a lot of evidence about how bad noise is for our health. So just these simple things that we take for granted in our own environment, when the prison is your whole world, they become really, really important and have a big effect. And what's quite interesting is we've studied this quite a lot in schools, and we know what we need to do to design well so that those are not real problems. And in some prisons that we also looked at, so there's some good examples in Scotland, for example, where they have used acoustic materials to help keep the noise down. They've introduced bigger windows so you can see out into the outside world better. And we're starting on the video showing how HMP Millsike is designed. It seems like some of those ideas are starting to happen in England and Wales as well, which is definitely a positive step forward.
I think if you think that we're living in Butlins, then you should take a visit to prison yourself. Yeah, just clarify. not saying that it was horrible, like all the way through my sentence. I'm just saying it's not Butlins, innit? And at the end of the day, yeah, I did do something and I did have to face my time inside. But, you know, the punishment in its own self is being in prison. So the prison being worse or terrible or awful is not part of what the judges sent me to prison for.
And if we were serious about designing prisons for rehabilitation and for people to thrive, what would that look like in practice?
I think a lot of the things that I've said about the big scale decisions are really important. I think connection with family has such a positive rehabilitation effect. So building prisons closer to communities. I think there's something about, like, what we haven't really talked about is that decision to build big prisons away from population centres also mean that it's out of sight and out of mind to most people. Most people don't get to visit in a prison. And I think I would say if there was one thing I could change that might make an effect would be, I think everybody in the country should at some point visit in a prison. Because when you see the work that goes on in prisons and what they're trying to do in very difficult circumstances, in very, overcrowded and not fit for purpose buildings, it makes you think about it differently. And I think in the UK, we've got a very black and white view of prison. It's like we think about it as a somewhere else that we put people who've done something wrong. And of course, it's much more complicated than that. And the work that the prison service does goes on often without recognition. There's a lot of people doing a lot of really good hard work in really difficult circumstances. And I think if we all understood that better, we might have a more mature conversation about what prison is for and what we need to invest in to make it work for people.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's, it is very much a hidden kind of thing for a lot of people, and it's part of the community. So, most people that anyone that hasn't been in or have a loved one in that actually has no idea about prison at all.
Exactly.
So I think that's really important that people are educated.
I think criminal justice needs to be turned into a public health issue. I don't think anyone is born wanting to commit crime or wanting to be sent to prison. I think there are a variety of factors that lead to that. And I think, like culture being a big one, socioeconomic group, trauma, right? And you don't often hear about that in the news, and we don't hear this holistic reporting of crime or even holistic discussions. We hear about a glorification of it, a fetishization. Yeah, like, Al Capone and like Godfather and all this stuff is really cool to watch. Pablo Escobar. Yeah. But like the guy in Hackney dealing coke out of his car isn't cool because like that's on our doorstep, right? And I think we have to take accountability as people for that. And I think the other thing is like we all need to be more willing to get involved in criminal justice, in prisons and things like that, because it's like that is our fundamental guard block in society. If you don't want a dangerous and unsafe society, you need a strong criminal justice system.
True.
And our criminal justice system is a shambles. And until we start having these discussions about every offense category, every type of thing that we don't want to happen in society, it's just going to keep happening, because I think prisons and criminal justice are like, you know, Carl Jung, he's like this famous psychologist. He talks about like the shadow self. Like you have what you present to the world and you have your shadow self, right? Prison is society's shadow self. But like so much of the realities of prison aren't spoken about because it's not palatable. Like it's not palatable to speak about specific types of offending. It's not palatable to speak about terrorism. And until I think we do, you know, on your public TV shows, on BBC News, we're going to see the same cycles repeat.
And just finishing on this point, because in my eyes, it's quite difficult to say, you know, people need this, they need that, prisons need this and they need this to help people. How are we supposed to do that with the prisons already? You know, if we spent that money on the prisons that are already running, would we still, in your eyes, be better off in the long run?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because we've got to a point where prisons are now really overcrowded. So the ability to do all of those good things has just got that much harder. You know, lots of our prisons are really old and we're having to spend quite a lot of money just to keep them going. And so I think the opportunity has to be about preventing people going into prison before we can start really improving things across the prison estate. Even if we build a few new prisons and they're designed well, we've still got hundreds of prisons across the country that are not well designed and are too old and falling apart. I think the other thing, like I talked about, educating the public or just exposing the public to what happens in prisons, it feels like that's just a really important, like you're not going to get far until you have a better public perception of what prisons are and what they do. Feels like that's a really important starting point. I was going to say about that thing of prisons being like they are a community facility in a way, right? And the Victorian prisons are mostly too small, they're cold, they're falling apart, they cost a lot of money to keep going. But they were mostly built in town and city centres, and they were there, they were present, and people knew about them. And so I think we thought about them differently then. And that shift away from having prisons in cities is part of this loss of public understanding about what prison does.
There's a lot of work being done at the older ages. We see in the education space, we see a lot of labels assigned to people like complex behavior or persistent negative behavior or hard to reach, all of these things. But for me, children don't become at risk or high risk once they get to secondary school. Often there were signs that were missed at a younger age. Like we know the things, research has showed us what makes children vulnerable. Like, for example, people from low socioeconomic background, people with special educational needs and disabilities, Black and ethnic minority students. I mean, one of the easiest ways to do it is look at the groups that are overrepresented in exclusion statistics, overrepresented in the criminal justice system. For me, almost what I'm doing is reverse engineering that and trying to provide support at a younger age. So actually, the work that I'm doing at the transition from primary to secondary school, I don't even see that as early. I feel like that's almost like a critical stage, but there's work at other transitions, like almost early years going into primary school, going from key stage 1 to key stage 2. Like there's points within the primary school journey that if we put more emphasis, if we spent more money, if we empower children as well. And I think we need to have that approach where we're looking at the whole problem, not just the isolated parts. So yeah, that's the focus of my work, is kind of that primary school transition and then looking down instead of up.
Thank you so much for today. It's been such an incredible conversation. I'm so interested in all of it and I'm so passionate about it. So thank you for sharing everything with me today and everyone listening.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Really appreciate you inviting me on. Thank you.
So that was my conversation with Roland. I found him so interesting to speak to, and he answered some of my burning questions that I've had for a while. And I find it so fascinating that things within the prison design, like lighting, space, even the location, can actually affect people's chances of rehabilitation. Like those two put together, and it's so important.
Yeah, so for me as a listener, it makes me think that if rehabilitation is supposed to be at the forefront, or at least a major part of the system, are we actually designing prisons to facilitate that, to make that possible? Or are we just repeating old mistakes? And something that stood out for me from what Roland said was that the Victorian prisons were built in town centres. So that was part of the community, because you'd walk past it and like, let's just say, casting your mind back to like what those times might be like. You might be seeing people going in and out, or people collecting their family members, or people leaving prison. So it's something that is less taboo or less scrutinized because it's there. It's right there.
Part of the
You're probably
community,
going
like
shopping
you
up
said,
there. You're probably school's not too far, whatever. Do you get what I'm saying?
Which is crazy because you must be talking about it so much more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, did you see so-and-so got released? Like, that's good for them. I see him with his dad. Like, do
I
you get
love
what
how
I mean?
you're just imagining people saying that.
I'm just
That's
saying,
really sweet.
I'm just saying, because
Yeah.
it's part there, and it's not like shunned.
But this is
or-
definitely out of sight, out of mind.
Whereas
Yeah.
the newer prisons that are built, all the more modern, are technically in the middle of nowhere,
Mm-hmm.
where we spoke about this before, but you're doing a long drive past fields and farmland before you get to see the prison. Do you get what I'm saying? So you're fully away from society. And I think that makes a difference in the mindset of the public when you're looking at prisons, when you're looking at rehabilitation, and when you're looking at reformation too. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
Also, what Sobanan said in his episode about criminal justice needs to be a public health issue, and no one is born to want to commit crime. And I just think that's so true. Like, this is something that we're, as society, we're kind of just like leaving
Mm-hmm.
as a problem and letting it be a problem and become more of a problem. Whereas this is a part of society that really needs help.
Yeah.
And why are we not looking at it like that?
I see. That's a great question, and that's a great point that Sobanan makes. And I think we could end up talking about that for hours, because there's loads of different factors that we can speak about in society as in general. But yeah, in addition to that, you know, Tony talks about with his organization the want and need to take, especially young black men, away from the inner cities, into the
Yeah.
countryside, to get that different experience. Because some people, the first time they leave the cities, is to go to prison sometimes. And that being your first experience of something outside the city is a bit strange, and that could do things to you. So I like that he said he's making a conscious effort to take people out into the countryside, away from the big cities, for a different type of healing and refreshment. And I think that makes a difference. Also, another thing that Roland mentioned was about the noise, and how certain prisons are built from concrete, so that further echoes and makes the noise louder. So then for you to communicate, you've also got to be louder. Then everyone starts getting louder, and it's a whole like coliseum of noise where and it gets a bit crazy, because
Yeah.
outside of the windows, even outside in the windows, someone's trying to shout, but that echoes onto the landing. Then you got other people speaking on their windows, and that echoes out, and then it makes the landing noisy, especially at nighttime.
You know what? The landing is noisy anyway.
Yeah,
And
but,
everybody in there probably has something to say.
yeah, but at bang up times when it's like late and you're
Yeah.
trying to get to sleep, and that's
It's-
echoing
yeah.
through the whole landing, it's like, brother, give me a break. You know what I'm saying? So, and that can affect
Yeah.
someone. You know, if you don't get a good night's sleep in prison, the next day is a bit long.
I mean, you don't get a good night's sleep.
In general,
Normally.
in general, I know, but
But
you
it's
know what
hard
I
to
mean?
sleep in there, definitely.
So yeah,
You know what? That ruined my sleep for months afterwards as well. I'd say a year.
I
I,
learned to
still
li-
struggle.
I learned to live with it.
Yeah.
Like, so much so that, yeah, I could just tune it out now. Big shout out to Frankie too, because what Frankie mentioned about prison visits, and I think prison visits, how visit spaces are designed and built for prison makes a big difference in terms of how you interact with your loved ones, especially young children. Do they know they're in a prison? Do you design it in a way that it could be daddy's workplace, just to like soften that blow? But I think he mentioned talking about seeing his daughter take her first steps on
In
a visit.
prison.
You know what I mean? The first time he's seen her walk in a prison visit, you know what I mean? So those kind of experiences, you never really think about how the design of a prison can really shape those experiences.
Well, it's everything.
Mm.
It is everything. When we're sitting in a small box like that, when you're sitting in a small room like that and everything's going on around you and you see the door lock and you have what you have around you, no ventilation, etc. Like you're living it and breathing it. That's why we have these questions, because that just doesn't feel right, does it? It doesn't feel good. And
it affects how you feel as well as a human being and how you can contribute towards your rehabilitation. And that's why I think that's where the cross section is, the interlink. Well,
Roland was amazing and I loved speaking to him. This is just the start of our 4-part mini-series where we're exploring how rehabilitation fits into the prison system. So next time I'll be speaking to Jenny Okolo about the specific challenges that neurodiverse people experience in prison and what kind of support can really make a difference for people leaving prison as well.
Yeah, we know we haven't spoke to everyone or covered every angle, but these conversations have given us, and you, we hope, a chance to hear something different perspectives on what works and the things that need to be changed and improved.
And if you're interested in learning more about prison reform and support, then check out the link in the show notes. We're going to put them there for you to have a look.
Yeah, so again, big up yourself, Jules. Some great conversations there. Thank you all for listening and we'll see you next time.